Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lesson we are going to introduce to our program the notion of user session. We are going to see what is the best way for modeling this concept and then we are going to implement it. In the last lesson we have created our session ID, but this is simply the identifier of the session. This is not the session itself. The session also contains the notion of validity. So it's starting to look that we would want to define here a data model class or interface for this notion. Let's do that. We are going to create here a session.ts file, and in this case we might be tempted initially to, for example, define this as an object interface called session. And this session interface would contain two properties. One would be the session ID as a string, and the second property would be the valid until timestamp that we are going to be defining using an external library called moment.js. So at this point in the course, you have already installed it here via the terminal. When you executed npm install at the moment that you changed branches, but if you need to install moment, you can do so doing npm install moment. And this is going to bring you a library that will allow you to handle dates in a very simple way. Add values to dates, such as, for example, add 3 days to a date, do date arithmetic. All of that is made very simple using moment. So with this interface in place, this is all the data that we would need to define the notion of a session. We would also want to associate to the session a user, so we would have here a second property, which would be the user class itself, the model class that we have defined here, that contains only the ID and the email, but not the password. We are not going to store that in memory on the server. So we have here these three properties that define a session. But the session also has a notion of validity. So we might be tempted to define here an external function called isSessionValid, for example, that would take as argument a session, and it would see, is this session still valid given a certain session validity? Well, for this type of situations where we have data that is closely associated to a function that calculates a derived property on top of the data, it's actually much better to define a class. So we are going to keep here the validUtil property. We are going to create here these two properties using a constructor, and we are going to make these two properties public properties of this class. We're going to add here the public keyword at the level of this member variable. So this is also creating here a member variable at the level of the class session. And we are going to do the same here for the user. So now this class has three properties, two that were calculated via the constructor, the session and the user. And it also has a third property that we're going to make private, which is the valid until timestamp. This property is going to be calculated at construction time based on a validity. So let's define first a validity. We are going to define here a static read-only variable. We're going to call it the validity in minutes. And we are going to say that the session is valid typically for at least an hour. But in this case, we are going to be using a very short validity so that we can test the expiration logic more easily. This value should be chosen depending on the application. So if the application does not have any business critical data, we can make this value larger. If it's a banking application, for example, we would want to make this value shorter. This means that the session will expire faster. So this also means that if somebody steals the session, it can only impersonate the user for a certain amount of time. After that, it would have to somehow be able to create a new session. And that is not possible without having the password as well, which the attacker would not have because the session is effectively replacing the password in terms of identification of the user. So with this in place, we just need to calculate here the valid until timestamp. And we are going to be using moment.js for that. We are going to calculate this at the moment of the construction of the session. we are going to call moment from moment.js. So this will give us back an instance of moment representing the current instant. And to the current timestamp, we are going to be adding here this validity in minutes. So we are going to access here this value session.validity, and we are going to specify that these are minutes and not hours, for example. There are other values that we can add here to add to the current timestamp. And with this in place, we have the valid until timestamp. So now, if we would like to know if a session is valid or not, we are going to add here a method to it, and we are going to compare the valid until timestamp with the current moment. So again, we are going to call moment to calculate the current moment, and we are going to be using the diff operator. So as you can see, you have auto-completion available because moment.js now ships with its own TypeScript definitions, so everything can be auto-completed. We are going to call diff to the current moment, and we are going to compare it to another moment, the valid until timestamp. And we are going to calculate the difference, let's say in minutes. And we are going to make sure that this is smaller than or equal to 0. If that is the case, then it means that the session is valid. So with this in place, we have a model class, the session class, that correctly models the notion of user session. So we are going to use this class to create a session using the ID and the user, and we have to store it somewhere. Let's see how can we store sessions in memory on the server. Let's also implement the session aspiration mechanism. This is coming right up in the next few lessons.